What is the most messed up family secret that you know about? Story 1. My grandfather on my dad's side suffered a fatal heart attack at just 40 years old, leaving my dad around 10 or 12 at the time. Not long after the funeral, my grandmother began a relationship with a man named Mitch, someone my dad and his siblings absolutely loathed. I used to hear Mitch's name mentioned every now and then growing up, but once I was old enough, I asked my mom about him, since my dad rarely speaks about his childhood. According to her, Mitch was a manipulative scammer who eventually married my grandma. Over time, he drained her financially, leading them to file for bankruptcy not once, not twice, but nearly 4 times. He was also physically abusive to my dad and his siblings, an ordeal that lasted until my dad was about 17 or 18. That's when, in a story my great-aunt loves to recall after a few margaritas, my dad finally lost it. He chased Mitch through the house with a baseball bat, forcing him to crawl under a bed in fear. Eventually, my grandmother had their marriage annulled and somehow managed to revert to her previous last name, which allowed her to resume receiving military benefits from her late husband. Story 2. On my dad's side, my grandfather served in Vietnam and went missing in action for several weeks. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened during that time. When he finally returned, he struggled with alcoholism and reckless behavior. My dad and his brothers often had to scour roadside ditches near the local bar to find him passed out. One night, after waking from a vivid nightmare, he mistakenly started choking my grandmother. Incidents like that severely strained his relationship with my father. While my dad harbors resentment toward him, it's also clear that much of his behavior stemmed from untreated PTSD. For that reason, I try not to take sides. Open Book Story 3. Rick and Ely Late, but here goes. My mom's first husband was a violent alcoholic who abused her and my sisters regularly. She lived in constant fear, too terrified to leave. When she finally escaped, she fled across the country with my sisters and began rebuilding her life. Eventually, she met my dad and had me. Everything she endured turned her into a strong, no-nonsense woman. My dad knew better than to test her. On the one occasion he raised his hand to her, she grabbed a broomstick and beat him until he cried. He never tried it again. Years later, my dad began cheating. My mom knew, but she kept quiet for nearly a year. Then, the woman he was seeing got into a horrific car accident and almost didn't survive. After that, he stopped seeing her. Eventually, my parents divorced due to his continued infidelity. A few years ago, while chatting with my mom about old times, we talked about that first woman. That's when she casually said, "Well, maybe someone messed with her brakes," before walking away. I'm fairly certain my mom had someone sabotage my dad's mistress's car. Story 4. My great-grandmother was confined to a psychiatric institution from 1928 until her death in 1978. For decades, the family believed she had died during childbirth. The truth, however, was far more disturbing. My great-grandfather had her committed, likely due to what we now recognize as postpartum depression. None of her daughters ever met her. He kept the secret buried, convinced that if people found out what really happened to their mother, no one would want to marry his daughters. He carried that burden until my grandfather joined the family through marriage. Only then did he reveal the truth. My grandfather, in turn, kept it secret throughout his marriage to my grandmother, who passed away just last year. Eventually, the guilt became too much, and he confessed everything to my mom. To this day, only she, my dad, my grandfather, and I know what really happened. Story 5. This one still breaks my heart. I regret not being kinder to her. At my all-girls private school, yes, kilts were involved, there was a girl who always stood out. She was overly needy, constantly trying to attach herself to anyone who showed her a little kindness. I didn't treat her poorly, but I also wasn't very warm. Even as a day student, I noticed something odd. She never seemed to go home. She only left when the school shut down completely, like during Christmas break. In the summer, she was shipped off to camp. I thought it was unusual but didn't give it much thought. Then came the shoplifting incident. During a weekend trip to the mall, she got caught stealing and was expelled for it. Total overreaction. If I, a day student, had done the same, I probably would have just lost mall privileges. Years went by and I forgot all about her. Then, during a chat with my friend's mom, who used to work for a local psychiatrist, I learned the truth. The girl's family had blamed her for her toddler brother's accidental death. He had drowned after crawling onto a pool cover while she was babysitting him. Ever since, they wanted nothing to do with her. She had been seeing a psychiatrist for guilt and abandonment. Despite everything, she was coping well, until the school expelled her. Her family took her back to the US and had her institutionalized. It's sickening what some parents are capable of. Story 6. My brother and I share the same mother but have different fathers. When we were both very young, his father shot and killed my dad, burying him in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He was convicted and sent to San Quentin. For years, my mother was vague about the details. Something never felt right, so as an adult, I started digging. The case had once been high profile in the Bay Area, and what I found was unsettling. All three, my father, my mother, and my brother's dad, were connected to serious drug use and had ties to the Hells Angels. That's when I learned the real reason my mother remained free. She testified against my brother's father to save herself from prison. Her exact role in the murder remains unclear, since her plea deal led to the redaction of her testimony. I've never confronted her about it. Not because I don't care, but because she wasn't a terrible parent. She clearly struggled during that time, and I've spent years making peace with what little I know. In the end, I chose forgiveness. Story 7. My aunt on my dad's side was trapped in a nightmare of a marriage, and no one stepped in to help. It wasn't just that her husband beat her. He beat her so badly that her kidneys failed. He even burned their son for misbehaving. This was back in the 80s and 90s, when there was almost no support for Asian women experiencing domestic violence in the UK. The abuse was no secret. He often hit her in public, even at her workplace, over trivial things like how a teacup was placed. The truth came to light when I was staying over at their house. He threatened my aunt, and I, just a kid, told him that wasn't nice. He punched me in the stomach. When my mom found out, she lost it. She stormed over, waited until no one was watching, and physically pulled my aunt and cousins out. Then she drove them all to Manchester. I had to take time off school. I was 12, and the punch had caused a hematoma. Could have been worse. Later, we learned something even more horrifying. The family had always known. They kept quiet to avoid the shame of divorce. Even after my mom exposed everything, they tried to defend him. My mom wasn't having it. She called the police, but not much came of it. He started stalking us, and I was sent to boarding school for my safety. The long-term damage to his children was clear. One grew up strong, the other spoiled and hollow. This experience taught me that abuse doesn't just hurt. It warps everyone around it. Story 8. My mom once told me something about my uncle that no one else talks about. When he was a teenager, he and his friends went to an older man's house after a night out drinking. Eventually, his friends left, and my uncle was alone with the man. That's when things turned sinister. The man started making unwanted advances. When my uncle tried to leave, the man became aggressive. A struggle followed, and my uncle ended up stabbing the man to death. He was arrested and held at Rikers Island while awaiting trial. According to my mom, it was a big news story at the time, though I've never found any records. Ultimately, he was acquitted and released. But the incident was buried. His children, my cousins, don't know it ever happened. Story 9. My family hid from me that I had a twin. I only found out when she reached out to me at 16. She had been adopted and raised in the US. I guess it's not the worst secret, but what stings is that no one has ever given me a reason why they gave her away. We weren't poor. We could have been raised together. But every time I asked, I got the same cold answer. It happened. Stop asking. Despite being raised in totally different households, mine chaotic and noisy, hers strict and Catholic, we were eerily similar. Same mannerisms, same way of cursing, same career paths. She became a doctor, brilliant and driven. Then, without warning, she died, likely from long QT syndrome. She never caught it, but because of her, I got tested. I had it too. Her death probably saved my life. Her husband didn't take it well. While I was in the US after she passed, I heard the gunshot as I stepped out of my car. He had taken his own life. I haven't been the same since. My parents barely reacted when I told them she died. so I never told them anything else. I don't care about the rest of the family, I just miss my twin. Story 10. My grandmother was adopted into a wealthy family as a child and grew up spoiled. Over time, she became selfish and disconnected from others' needs. Eventually, she was kicked out and forced to survive on her own. That's when she had my uncles, my mom, and my aunt. By the time my aunt was born, my grandmother was deep into her drinking and partying. One bitter winter night, she left to go out drinking and didn't close the door behind her. My baby aunt crawled outside and froze to death. She was found the next morning. My grandmother faced no consequences. She wasn't charged, never spent a night in jail. Instead, she found religion and convinced herself that faith would redeem her. No one in the family ever talks about what happened, but I visited the grave. Story 11. On my mom's side, things get incredibly tangled. She was adopted, but in her early 20s, she tracked down her biological mother and called her, only to be hung up on. Shortly after, the woman's husband called my mom back. He told her, very bluntly, she's not well, and then gave my mom all the background she'd been looking for. Her birth mother had been married but was involved in several affairs, eventually becoming pregnant without knowing who the father was. My mom was placed for adoption as a result. The best guess is that her biological father was some drummer named Joe who played in a band. My mom also had two older adopted brothers. The younger of the two died in a tragic accident at a factory. Large pipes collapsed and crushed him. After his death, we found some old letters written by my great-uncle to a male partner. This was decades ago, when being in a same-gender relationship was considered scandalous. And then there's our ancestor who was killed in a duel in Iowa. The duel was supposed to be staged with blanks, but one of the men showed up with real bullets. It all started over a dispute about horses trespassing on property. My mom still has the newspaper clipping. Oh, and one more thing, one of our relatives was a 33rd degree Freemason of the Scottish Rite, or whatever the official term is. Story 12. My uncle ran off to California with his brother's wife, my dad's wife. At first, my dad didn't suspect anything. He thought they both just wanted a change of scenery and moved west. He stayed behind for work. He had no idea what had really happened until much later. 2 years later, he went to visit them. By then, he had already filed for divorce after coming home one day to find her gone. While relaxing in their pool during the visit, she casually said, "You do know your brother and I are together, right? That's why we left." My dad was stunned. He got out of the pool without a word. As he walked away, his brother called out, "Where are you going?" "I made drinks." My dad didn't even look back. He just said, "You're dead to me." Years passed and eventually he forgave them, but it's still hard to believe someone would betray their own sibling like that. Story 13. This one isn't about my family, but a kid I knew growing up. His father was a strict military man, so much so that he wouldn't even let male guests sit next to his wife or daughter at dinner. The entire household felt stifled under his rules. But every few weeks, when he left on assignment in California, the whole family would breathe easier. Fast forward 17 years. The father was about to be promoted to general. His kids were grown and preparing for college. Then, out of nowhere, he announced that he had a second family in California and was choosing them over his original one. His wife, who had supported him through everything, was devastated. She was nearly 60, suddenly single, and realizing her entire life had been a lie. The only silver lining was that she received a substantial portion of his pension and benefits in the divorce. But no amount of money could ever make up for that kind of betrayal. Story 14. My family has always suspected that my uncle was responsible for my aunt's death. He claimed she took her own life, but there were 2 bullet holes in the living room, even though she supposedly died in the bathroom. She was the kind of person who handwrote letters for everything, even into her 60s. But the note she supposedly left was typed on an old desktop computer, completely out of character. Even more suspicious, the timestamp on the note came after the 911 call had already been made. A week later, my uncle destroyed the computer. We never told my mom. It was her sister, and the truth would have shattered her. But we listened to the 911 recordings, and you can clearly hear my aunt crying for help. We told the police everything, but real life isn't like the movies. Nothing ever came of it. To this day, when people ask how she died, we usually just say it was a car crash. Story 15. My dad believes his own father tried to kill their family multiple times in the 1950s to start over with someone else. He would organize dangerous outings and make them look like accidents. Once, during a trip to their summer cabin, the house burned to the ground, with everyone inside except for my grandfather, who just happened to be out. Another time, there was a tragic boating incident that killed my dad's then-pregnant mother, her father, and his 3 sisters. My dad was only 5 at the time and survived because his grandfather managed to get him onto the overturned boat. He watched as everyone else drowned, drifting alone until fishermen rescued him. When he was finally returned to his father, the reaction was chilling. No tears, no rushing to embrace him. Just shock. A year later, his father remarried a Danish woman who had once been engaged to a German soldier during the Nazi occupation. She eventually married into our family. Once, she told me she used to have a signed copy of Mein Kampf, though she claimed to have thrown it away. She spent every penny of my grandfather's wealth after he sold his business. Story 16. There's a secret in my family we don't talk about. My mother. My sister and I are fairly certain she's on the autism spectrum, possibly Asperger's. A family friend with a PhD once said the same. It explains so much. She claims she was abused by her father, but our grandmother tells a completely different story, one filled with love and admiration for her husband. We do know some facts. When my mom was 3 and her brother was 4, their dad disappeared for a full year. My uncle doesn't speak poorly of him. He just says their father was strange, and that he learned early not to get in his way. Something my mother never figured out. Then, just as suddenly as he left, he returned, and no one questioned it. This pattern of vanishing runs in the family. My great-grandfather abandoned his wife soon after marriage, leaving only a note saying he didn't want children. He came from a wealthy family, and his parents ended up raising my grandfather. My mother has a lot of issues. She's attempted overdoses multiple times, not from depression, but as reactions when things didn't go her way. Once, we called her out for saying something inappropriate at a restaurant, and when we didn't apologize, she overdosed. The next day, no one talked about it. It's like it never happened. My way of coping, moving across the country and keeping my distance, is what keeps me sane. Story 17. This isn't my secret, but it still haunts me. My ex-wife's step-grandfather had been part of the family long before she was born, and he had hurt nearly every child in it. Cousins, nieces, nephews, grandchildren. Everyone knew, but no one ever confronted him. He was still invited to all the holiday gatherings, still allowed near children. I couldn't understand it. These were everyday people, working jobs, raising kids, paying mortgages. Yet they acted like this was just some uncomfortable fact to be ignored. I asked around, trying to understand why they kept him around. The excuses were pathetic. I tolerated it for a while for my ex-wife's sake. But then one night at a family event, he got a new girlfriend, an elderly woman in her 80s. He looked around the room and joked, "If I take off my glasses, she looks like a schoolgirl." That was it for me. I never saw him again. When people asked why I refused to come around, I told them straight. Because he was a predator. Their reaction? Oh, that was all in the past. It was sickening. Story 18. My mom's side of the family is a mess. She has 2 brothers and 1 sister. The older brother once lost a bar fight, left angry, went to his truck, and came back with a shotgun. He spent the next 20 years in prison. I didn't even know about it until years later when he got kicked out of our house for selling drugs out of my bedroom window. Her other brother is openly racist and has a bunker in his backyard, convinced the South will rise again. Hardly anyone talks to him and he doesn't seem to care. Then there's my aunt. She once accused my mom of trying to steal her 2 daughters out of jealousy. Rather than talk it out, she packed her things and disappeared. We've had no contact since. Her daughters aren't even allowed to speak to us. The worst, though, is my grandmother. When my mom was a child, she used to drug her when she got too excited. One Christmas, my mom was overly happy about Santa coming, so my grandmother gave her too much. My mom slept through the entire holiday. She was out for 2 full days, all because she was too cheerful. Story 19. This story still weighs on me. When I was in elementary school, my siblings and I were taken from our mom due to her serious drug problems. My dad fought hard for custody and eventually won. But my youngest sister, who was 6 years younger than me, went to live with her father. My mom had her after divorcing mine. We didn't hear from her for nearly a decade. Then, out of the blue, she reconnected with us. She remembered all of us clearly, even though we hadn't seen her since she was a toddler. But here's the thing. She has no idea why our mom vanished from her life. She doesn't know about the addiction, the custody battles, any of it. She's in high school now and struggles with trust and abandonment. I wish I could tell her everything, but I feel like it's her father's place to explain, not mine. I live across the country and work constantly, so we're not as close as I'd like. My oldest sister stays in touch with her more. I just hope she finds peace. Story 20. Both of my Catholic paternal grandparents had been married before they found each other, a fact they rarely discussed. My grandmother had a son named Leo, who passed away at just 2 years old. She mourned him for the rest of her life and always considered him her firstborn, even after having 5 more children. My grandfather's past was even more surprising. After he died, we were sorting through his things and found a photo of him standing next to a striking brunette. She looked like a movie star. I showed it to my dad, and he casually replied, "Oh yeah, we'll have to call your other aunt." That was how I learned my grandfather had once been married to the heiress of the King Ranch in Texas. None of the other kids knew. On my mom's side, things were just as complicated. Her father was extremely prejudiced, which made the likelihood that he had African ancestry incredibly ironic. There's also a long-standing rumor that my great-grandmother was a kidnapped Native American girl. No one really knows for sure. Story 21. For most of our lives, we believed my mom had only one sister. Turns out that wasn't true. About 8 years ago, my half-brother, my dad's son from a previous marriage, got a call from a woman he'd never heard of. She claimed to be my mom's older sister, a sibling nobody knew existed. It turns out that when my grandparents were just 19, they had a baby girl and put her up for adoption. They never spoke of her again, not to their children, and certainly not to us grandchildren. The woman had been searching for her biological family for years and eventually found my grandparents. They had been speaking with her in secret before she finally reached out to my brother. Because she happened to live in the same state as him, across the country from the rest of us, that's how we found out. I still remember the phone call when my brother told my dad. It was a wild way to discover we had a secret aunt. Story 22. My granny was born into a truly difficult situation in Colorado, 1949. Her mother was just 16 years old, and no one knows who the father was. Some say her mother had a reputation for being promiscuous. Others suggest she may have been doing sex work. Regardless, she didn't want my granny and handed her over to her own mother. Granny lived with her grandmother until she passed away when Granny was only 5. She was then sent to live with a great aunt who was downright cruel. This woman already had children and never accepted Granny, or the twins she was also raising, as family. Granny alone was singled out for especially harsh treatment. At 5, she was forced to clean the entire house and punished if it wasn't done perfectly. That punishment was being locked in a dark, moldy cellar filled with rats. Sometimes, she hadn't even done anything wrong. The aunt just made up reasons. She still has scars on her arms and face from rat bites. She was even denied use of the indoor toilet because her aunt believed a 5-year-old might tempt her husband. It gets worse. A magpie the aunt kept as a pet would be released under the table during meals to peck Granny's legs while she ate. Crying wasn't allowed. And when Granny's slightly autistic brother had an episode and wet himself, the aunt tied him to a high chair, left him outside in the snow, and burned him with a match as punishment. They lived like this for 4 years. It scarred all of them. Her little sister grew up extremely self-centered, and her brothers never talk about what happened. Granny's story is just one part of it. There's a lot more, but even this feels like a tragic novel. Story 23. When my mom was a teenager, her family went camping in Wales in their camper van. One day, a hang glider showed up and asked my granddad for a push off the cliff. My granddad, being friendly, had already spoken to another hang glider earlier who had decided the wind conditions were unsafe for flying. He tried to warn the man, but the guy insisted. He claimed to be a pro and knew what he was doing. Eventually, my granddad and uncle, who was about 13 at the time, gave him the push he asked for. The man floated for only a few seconds before dropping straight down, 200 feet to the beach below. Emergency services arrived, but it was too late. My family panicked and left the area quickly. Years later, my granddad and I did some research. It turns out the man really was a professional, but he was also under the influence of LSD at the time. He died on impact. My granddad never forgave himself. Story 24. My great-grandmother kept a lot of things hidden. One of the more absurd secrets was about her children. She had 5 kids with one man, then married someone else and had 2 more. But instead of telling the truth, she created a whole backstory. She even made her new husband change his name to William, so it looked like their son, little Billy, was named after him. The children were so young they didn't remember their biological father, except the eldest daughter, who died young under suspicious conditions. She had married a doctor, and the family believes he may have killed her with an air embolism. It was never proven. Later, when one of the boys tried to join the military, he needed his birth records. That's when the truth came out about the name changes and tangled lineage. After my great-grandmother passed, we found records of 2 babies, twins, who died shortly after birth, and possibly a 3rd baby no one can trace. Sadly, she had dementia by the time we uncovered all this. Before she passed, she told us she had skeletons in the closet, but never shared what they were. I hope we found everything, but part of me still wonders if there's more. Story 25. My aunt and the father of her first 2 children were engaged and planning to marry. Everything seemed stable until 6 weeks before the wedding, when he had a panic attack so severe, he climbed into a treehouse in the backyard and tried to take his own life. The only reason he survived was because their 2 small children, just 6 and 4, found him in time. He got help, and 2 years later they decided to try again. But 4 weeks before the new wedding date, he climbed back into the treehouse and attempted another overdose. Once again, the kids found him. He was committed to a mental health facility after that. Since then, my aunt has remarried, first to a man who dealt drugs and was abusive, and now to someone else. Her children still take medication for PTSD. As if that's not horrifying enough, I've never met my mom's biological father. He and his best friend ran a child exploitation ring. My mother was one of the victims. That's a truth I still struggle to process. Story 26. I'm fairly convinced my grandfather killed someone. He and my grandmother were known for their generosity, often letting people stay with them when they were down on their luck. They even kept a scrapbook with photos of those they helped. One day, I was flipping through it when my granddad saw a specific photo, snatched the book from me, ripped that photo out, and threw it into the fireplace without saying a word. When I asked my mom about it, she gave a vague response like, "Some people just can't be helped." That's when I started noticing something else strange. The layout of their house. It's a small 1-bedroom place, but the floor plans say there should be an extra room in the basement the size of the kitchen and lounge combined. But when I went down there, I saw that part of the basement had been bricked off. I have no idea what's behind that wall, but I can't shake the feeling that someone who once stayed there crossed a line and never left. Story 27. This one's about a friend's grandparents. The grandmother was known for being irritable in the mornings but mellowed out as the day went on. Every afternoon, her husband would bring her a caffeine-free Diet Pepsi with a straw already in it. She'd sip it and gradually become more cheerful. Turns out, he had been secretly adding alcohol to her drinks. She was unknowingly getting tipsy every day. Eventually, the combination of alcohol and her medications took its toll. Her liver failed and she died in the hospital. After she passed, her husband declined rapidly. He developed dementia and was arrested for inappropriately touching a disabled woman he had been giving rides to. His daughter took over his care, sold his house, and built a large addition onto her own to accommodate him. But he didn't last long, he passed away within the year. Story 28. I can't confirm this one, but my dad swears it's true. My grandfather had 6 siblings, 5 brothers and 1 sister. All 5 brothers served in Korea, but one of them later joined the Green Berets and experienced a mental breakdown. After that, he simply disappeared. My family believes he went rogue and has been living somewhere in South America for over 30 years. No one has heard from him since. All of Grandpa's siblings are gone now, except for 1 brother in Kansas. The missing one would be in his early 90s today, if he's even still alive. No one knows what he did, why he left, or where he ended up. It's just a mystery tied into our family's long connection to the military. Story 29. My family's past is riddled with addiction and trauma. At one point, my sister walked in on her daughter and her ex-boyfriend together, both unclothed. Not long after, my niece announced she was pregnant. She was about 18 or 19 at the time. I don't know how long it had been going on. Another sister injected heroin into her husband, who was terrified of needles. He died. A year later, she died the same way. They were both addicts. One of my nephews might actually be my brother. My sister refuses to say who the father is, but she always hated our dad, who wasn't even her biological father. Her real father died, and our mom remarried. As for me, when I was 10, I slashed my wrists and blamed my mom. I thought that if I could prove she was hurting me, they'd let me live with one of my sisters. The courts knew I was lying but still removed me for a few weeks. When I returned, home life became unbearable. I've never admitted this to anyone, but I'm happy now. I'm in a loving relationship that's lasted over 20 years. I chose not to have kids. Not because I wouldn't love them, but because I was afraid I'd become the kind of parent I grew up with. Story 30. This story is about my friend Tom and his older brother Jay, who works on a ship and is gone for months at a time. Jay is married to Kate, and they have 2 sons. The boys look alike but aren't twins. Jay is small and fair-skinned. Tom, on the other hand, is tall, muscular, and darker. While Jay was away at sea, Kate stayed in the family home with Tom. Eventually, Kate got pregnant again. The baby came out much bigger than the other 2 boys and noticeably darker. Rumors started swirling that Tom was the real father. I didn't think much of it until I spoke with my cousin, who lives nearby. One day, Jay's youngest son ran past us. When we asked him where Uncle Tom was, the boy shrugged and said, "I don't know, but I saw Uncle Tom kiss and hug Mom last night." Not long after, Jay returned home. What followed was chaos. Screaming, broken glass, a full-blown meltdown. Jay found out the truth. He no longer returns to our hometown. From what I've heard, Tom and Kate now have a daughter together as well. Kate now has 4 kids, 2 from each brother. Story 31. My aunt was engaged for over 10 years before her relationship ended. After the breakup, she tried online dating and met someone long distance. They chatted regularly through webcam, hers was on, but he never turned his on. He would text her while watching her fall asleep, claiming his camera was broken. It was strange, but she was lonely and went along with it. Eventually, she convinced him to speak on the phone. That's when things got bizarre. The voice on the other end turned out to be a woman. When confronted, the woman claimed that her deceased brother's spirit was living inside her, that he was the one my aunt had been talking to. Instead of cutting ties, my aunt drove all the way from Vermont to Arizona to pick her up. She brought her back to live with her and her 3 children. At first, things were just odd. The woman left sage bundles outside the kids' rooms to ward off bad spirits, and convinced my aunt to sell most of her belongings. Once, she even broke her arm and claimed spirits had pushed her down the stairs. Eventually, they entered a civil union. But then things took a dark turn. The woman tried to abduct my aunt's youngest son and take him back to a group she had ties to in Arizona. Thankfully, she was stopped before she could leave with him. By then, she had emptied my aunt's and grandparents' bank accounts. The civil union was annulled, and my aunt hasn't seen or heard from the woman since. Story 32. A friend of mine grew up in a family that owned a funeral home. He had an older brother, and what no one knew, except for a select few, was that the 2 boys weren't full siblings. One was the son of the funeral home owners, and the other was fathered by an employee of the business. The son of the owners always seemed a bit off. One day, when he was still a child, he set the funeral home on fire. His parents were trapped inside and died in the blaze. He believed his half-brother perished too, but he was wrong. The employee, who was actually the boy's biological father, managed to rescue his son from the fire. Rather than reveal the truth, he hid the badly injured boy away in a psychiatric facility for years. Meanwhile, the child who had set the fire inherited the remnants of the business and carried on the family legacy. Never knowing his half-brother had survived, the employee stayed by his side, acting as a mentor, keeping the secret. Then, 20 years later, everything came to light. The surviving brother appeared on national television, his face severely scarred, wearing a mask. Ever since, the two brothers have been locked in a bitter feud over the funeral home, one who inherited it, and the other who believes it was rightfully his. Story 33. There have been many disturbing stories about the Kennedy family, but this one is particularly tragic. While giving birth to their daughter, the nurse was instructed not to let the baby be delivered until the doctor arrived. He was the only one who could officially deliver the child and be paid. The nurse held the baby's head in the birth canal for hours. By the time the doctor got there, the baby had suffered severe oxygen deprivation, resulting in developmental disabilities. The family, embarrassed by her condition, kept her hidden from the public. As she grew older, they worried she might become pregnant, which would further tarnish the family's image. So her father approved a procedure that was horrifying. She was given a lobotomy without the rest of the family's consent. At the time, doctors didn't fully understand how lobotomies worked. They continued cutting into her brain until she stopped speaking. After the procedure, she was institutionalized, and the family told everyone she had moved to the Midwest to teach and wanted privacy. She spent the rest of her life locked away, all because her family was too ashamed to let her live freely. Story 34. My mom's older brother has been married 3 times. His first marriage resulted in a daughter who's now in her 30s. His second marriage produced 2 more daughters. His third, current marriage brought him a son. I've always been close with that cousin, the son, because we grew up together. But I never really met my female cousins. That's because my uncle completely cut off his first 2 families. A couple of years ago, I found out the reason why. His first wife wasn't just someone he divorced. She was someone he had assaulted. He had attacked and harmed her when they were both in their early 20s. When she got pregnant, he was forced to marry her, as was common in 1970s China to avoid public disgrace. As for the second marriage, the details are murky. Apparently, he fell for another woman and left his second wife for her. What makes it worse is that his son, my cousin, has no idea he has half-sisters out there. I can't stand my uncle. Story 35. One of the most manipulative things I've ever heard of was pulled off by my husband's uncle. He convinced his own mother, my husband's grandmother, to sell her house, give him the money, and move into assisted living. How did he do it? He hired a medium, someone who pretended to channel her deceased husband. The medium shared deeply personal family details and claimed her husband was saddened by their daughter's actions. In particular, he said that their daughter, my husband's mother, had recently terminated a pregnancy, and that her father in the afterlife was holding the lost child and crying. The medium claimed the only way to make things right was to give everything to her son. She believed it. She sold the house, gave him the money, and disowned her daughter, whom she now considered a disgrace. The worst part is that my mother-in-law believed it too. She carried that guilt for years, thinking her father was ashamed of her. The uncle eventually admitted what he did while drunk at a bar. He thought it was funny. It was anything but. Story 36. We're fairly certain that my grandmother and her lover were responsible for my grandfather's death. They had been having an affair for about a year. One night, she took all the kids out to the movies and left him at home alone. After the film, she told the kids to wait in the car while she went inside. Minutes later, an ambulance showed up. My grandfather was carried out on a stretcher. She claimed he had a sudden heart attack. No autopsy was performed. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, even though he was only 35 and in excellent health. He wasn't just any man, he was a respected scientist who worked for NASA, taught at MIT, and held several patents. When he died, my grandmother inherited everything and immediately invested in her lover's business. Problem was, there was no business. The man vanished with all the money. Once my mom and her siblings were old enough to realize what might have happened, they all cut my grandmother out of their lives, except my mom. She still suspects something, but believes her mother shouldn't die alone. Story 37. I don't think anyone in our family knows this except me and my sister. We believe our mom may have caused our brother's brain damage. She once told me, in a moment of emotional honesty, that she had tried to end her life by drinking bleach. It didn't work, and shortly afterward, she found out she was pregnant. It adds up. The rest of us are fairly bright, but this brother has always struggled. He exhibits unusual behaviors. Random clapping, whispering to himself, isolating, and speaking in strange voices. Now that he's an adult, he drinks too much. My mom has always favored him, spoiled him, defended him even when he bullied us. My dad, on the other hand, never acknowledged that anything was wrong. He was harsh with my brother and refused to allow him to get tested or seek help. It's a tough situation. My sister and I try to be kind to him, even when he scares us. I don't think he's dangerous, but something's clearly not right, and we'll probably never know the full extent of it. Story 38. Everyone in my family believes my father died of a heart attack during a business trip. I don't. I was the only one who went to the town where it happened to retrieve his body and speak with the authorities. What I saw didn't add up. There were signs of a struggle, bruising and cuts that didn't fit the story. Just before his death, my father had told me he was about to close a major business deal, one that would bring in a large sum of money. But after he died, we never saw a single cent. I strongly believe he was killed by his business partners. They were influential people in that region, and the local officials had no interest in investigating further. I was left with a choice: dig deeper and risk trouble or let it go. I agreed to list the cause of death as cardiac arrest. I had him cremated and returned home. No one else in my family knows what I saw. I carry that secret alone. At this point, telling the truth would only cause pain. Story 39. Just after I turned 16, my dad sat me down and told me I was old enough to learn the family's biggest secret. I thought it was going to be some goofy story, but it wasn't. He told me my grandfather had been part of the Russian mob back in Moscow. Then he pulled out an old photo of him sitting with a group of men, smoking and laughing. That's when I realized some of his old friends had always seemed a little off. But it didn't stop there. My dad then told me that my maternal grandmother, who was from Shanghai, had once been married to a different man before she met my grandfather. That first husband was involved in organized crime in China. She had an affair with my English grandfather and got pregnant with my mom. Rather than leave, she and her first husband agreed to raise the baby together. Years later, my mom met my dad at boarding school in Germany. They got engaged in England. Then things took a dark turn. My dad's father and my mom's father met. Turns out their organizations had crossed paths in the past. After that meeting, my maternal grandfather was killed. My mom split from my dad and vanished, while she was pregnant with me. My dad took full custody, and I grew up thinking his new wife was my mother. She wasn't. She was Dutch and had grown up in Algeria. I met my real mom only once. She died at age 40 due to a shark attack while traveling in the Caribbean. That day, my dad told me everything. I was stunned. I'd lived my life thinking one thing, only to discover it was something entirely different. Story 40. When my dad was 15, he refused to go on a fishing trip with his uncle. The rest of the family said he was being disrespectful. But there was a reason he wouldn't go. His uncle had been creeping into his bedroom at night for years. He finally told his older brother, who told their dad. My grandfather didn't believe them and said they were making up stories to avoid chores. That weekend, my dad's brother took a baseball bat and broke the uncle's kneecap while he was sleeping in the guest room. No charges were filed. The uncle moved away, and the family never spoke of it again. To this day, my dad won't go near lakes. He still calls his brother his hero. Story 41. My great-grandmother had a child out of wedlock in the 1920s. The father was a black jazz musician. Her parents disowned her, and the baby was taken away the moment it was born. They told her the child had died. She never believed it. She spent her life writing letters to orphanages and hospitals under different names. No one responded. She died clutching a photo of a man she swore was her son, taken from a newspaper clipping in the 1960s. We only found out the truth when we cleaned out her attic. I still wonder if he's alive somewhere. Unaware his mother never stopped looking. Story 42. My cousin is in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The real criminal? His younger brother. At 17, his brother accidentally killed someone during a fight. Panicked, the family came up with a plan. My cousin, already in trouble with the law for minor things, would take the fall in exchange for money and a fresh start when he got out. He agreed, thinking he'd be out in a few years. It's been 15. No fresh start. No support. His brother is thriving, married with kids, pretending none of it ever happened. Story 43. My aunt died under mysterious circumstances when I was 12. The official story was that she slipped down the stairs. But I overheard my grandmother sobbing one night, saying, "He finally did it." Years later, I found out my aunt had been trying to leave her husband. She had filed a restraining order. The stairs were carpeted, barely steep, and she had bruises all over her arms and neck. No autopsy was done. Her husband moved to another state and remarried within the year. Every time I see her name on the family tree, I feel sick. Story 44. My grandmother used to sneak food to a man who lived in her basement. I always thought it was just a weird tenant. Turns out he was her brother, my great-uncle, who had escaped from a psychiatric hospital in the 1960s. He had been institutionalized for immoral behavior, which included being gay and refusing to join the military. My great-grandparents declared him dead to avoid shame. My grandmother found him years later and let him live in hiding. He stayed underground for over a decade, never leaving the house. When he died, she buried him in the backyard and put a statue over the grave. We only pieced it together after she passed. Story 45. My father saved his sister's life by killing her husband. He never told anyone, not even me, until he was on his deathbed. He said, "I did something I'll never regret, but I never want you to repeat it." When I pressed him, he told me her husband had been hurting their kids for years. The police didn't believe her, said she had no proof. So my dad waited for him in the garage one night and made it look like a burglary. The man was found with blunt force trauma and no suspects. My aunt moved across the country and changed her name. Her kids are grown now and doing well. Story 46. I found out at 25 that my mom had a child before me. A sister. No one ever mentioned her, not once. I was going through medical paperwork when I saw a birth listed in her old records. I asked my dad and he went pale. Later, my mom admitted she was forced to give up the baby by her parents. She cried like I'd never seen before. She kept a photo hidden in her Bible for decades. I've tried to track my sister down, but the adoption was closed. All I have is a name and the knowledge that somewhere out there, I have a sibling who has no idea I exist. Story 47. My grandfather was a war hero, or so we thought. After he died, we found a box in his closet with Nazi medals, documents in German, and a photo of him in a uniform that didn't match the one he wore in U.S. military pictures. He had always refused to talk about the war. My uncle did some digging. Turns out, he had been part of a Nazi division in his youth and defected near the end of the war. He changed his name, enlisted in the U.S. Army, and built a new life. My mom refuses to believe it, but the documents don't lie. Story 48. When I was 10, I saw my dad hit my mom for the first time. She told me it was a grown-up problem and not to talk about it. I kept quiet until I was 16, when he nearly choked her in front of me. That's when my brother pulled a knife on him. My dad left that night and never came back. The secret? My brother didn't just threaten him. He stabbed him in the leg to make sure he'd never return. The police were never called. My dad told everyone he left for a new job. We've never seen him again. Story 49. My sister was adopted, but no one told her. Not until she needed a blood transfusion at 28 and found out her parents weren't a match. She called me in tears. I had to confess that I knew. Everyone did. The extended family, the neighbors, even old family friends. Her adoption was common knowledge, except to her. She hasn't spoken to our parents since. She moved out of state, changed her last name, and told me she doesn't want to be lied to ever again. I don't blame her. I just wish I'd had the courage to tell her sooner.